What is up, everyone? Welcome to this latest edition of the IDP Plus podcast. I am your host, Matt Record at mrecord21. I am playing solo tonight as my normal co-host, Steve Dynasty Santa is seeing to some other things. So you get a classic Matty Rex solo episode. What we're going to talk about today is going back in the past. We are nothing but accountable for our actions here at IDP Plus Podcast, where we're going to tell you where we messed up and where we got things right. So, going back, continuing our series of looking at our tiers episodes that we kind of put out last July or so. But yeah, tonight we are talking, or today we are talking about the defensive backs. So for those of you that remember what we did, we were given our rankers 20 or so defensive backs to put into 5 tiers. Some names that we wanted to talk about at the time, as well as the staples there at the top of your boards. But again, sort of top 20 or 5 tiers of the top 20 folks. If you get to the bottom, you'll see that we did talk about some folks just because they were names. We wanted to talk about them. Not necessarily that we thought they'd be top 20, but conversation piece, so to speak. So we're going to hold ourselves accountable. I'm going to talk through these top 20 folks, see how they actually did in our scoring system, and talk about maybe their future and go from there. Before we dive into that content, though, as always, we are brought to you by the lovely folks over at Trophy Smack. Heck yeah, they have a bunch of really great goods over there. We have this ring that I'm looking up on YouTube, holding up the screen, a really sick championship ring. They have belts. They have wall art, not just for fantasy football, but common or other sports. So much of it's customizable. You can make it whatever you want it to be. But head over to trophysmack.com. Use code IDP guys at checkout. When you get a championship belt or a trophy, you get a free one of those championship rings. Go check them out. We love everything they make. They've been great sponsors of this podcast. Go and do it. All right, let us get to talking about these tiers. Tier 1, we only had one person in this tier, a tier alone, so to speak. Derwin James there. Yeah, he is the number one defensive back, and there's no question about it. So where did he end up? He finished 6th in points per game in our scoring, which is balanced scoring. 15.912 points per game. He played in 16 games. He played 93% of the defensive snaps on the year. You can't be mad at where he finished the year. I mean, yes, he finished 6th. You drafted him probably as the top defensive back in your league, but you draft them there for that consistency and know he's going to be there for you every single week. You got that with the 16 games played. You got that with the 6th highest points per game finish. Can't really complain about that. You could, but if you're in a 10-team league, he still finished as a DB1 for you. That's the nice peace of mind you get when you can have Derwin James. Obviously, for Dynasty, he's still probably the 101. You just don't get this kind of production this consistently. It's so hard to find, especially at the defensive back spot, which you'll see some of these guys that we thought were going to be really good this year really underperformed. So Dynasty, he's still the top defensive back. Redraft, yeah, he'll still be the first defensive back taken, and for good reason. Derwin James, tier 1. Everyone called him tier 1. That's just a win. Let's move on. Tier 2 is where where it gets a little hairy, so to speak. A lot of disappointment here in tier 2. So before actually going into individual analysis, I'm just going to read these off for those who are listening to me and anywhere you can listen to podcasts. But we had Talanoa Hufanga, Jaquan Brisker, Kyle Hamilton, Jalen Petrie, Cameron Curl, and Minka Fitzpatrick. So a whole bunch of things around the board here. So let's just start here at the top. Talanoa Hufanga ended up as the 32nd points per game finisher in our scoring, 12.28 points. He only played in 10 games played, but he did have 89% of the defensive snaps in those games. He is a fascinating character. So actually looking at his stats on the year, He ended up with 52 combined tackles, 3 interceptions, 3 passes defended, only one tackle for a loss. So Hufanga has been, a fun name, up and comer, so to speak, a fantasy darling, sleeper for a while. His value is very much predicated on those splash plays. So where he plays on the defense, he doesn't get access to as many tackles as one would expect. So let's see, 52 combined tackles in 10 games. So he's getting 5 combined tackles. Like, that's fine, but that's not elite. In order to take him into this tier 2, you'd expect that kind of tackles with the splash plays. And this year totally fell down to earth. Like I said, 0 sacks, only 3 interceptions. Yes, he only played in 10 games, so it's hard to really make up for that. But this is, again, 32nd points per game finish. So even in the games he's playing, he was disappointing you when you had him out there. Granted, 32nd, if you're in a 10-team, 12-team league, he still finishes a DB3. Obviously, it's hard to knock him for getting hurt. So he was still valuable, but we really thought he was going to break out this year and be the next best thing. It just didn't happen. He's probably a hold. I don't know if I would sell him for much at this point because you still have that hope. He's still very good on that defense, still a really established player there. But his redraft value definitely took a hit, and we kind of just missed it. We thought there'd be more splash plays, but they're hard to predict. All right, Jaquan Brisker is someone who did perform up to expectations. He ended up 13th in points per game, 14.267 points. He played 15 games. He played 95% of the defensive snaps. We had him there in tier 2, and I dare say he delivered. Let's see the stats. Yeah, he crossed 115 combined tackles, 1 fumble recovery, 2 forced fumbles, 1 interception, a sack, 9 passes defended, 3 tackles for loss. Yeah, he was all over the place. He played in all the games. He was consistent. He finished 13th. The sky is the limit for the young Chicago Bear. He will probably be in tier 2 again, especially if you keep Derwin James in his tier 1. But the future is extremely bright for Jaquan Brisker. And speaking of futures that are bright, Kyle Hamilton, dang it, you finally did it. You finally did the breakout thing we wanted you to do. He ended up finishing 8th in the points per game. He played 15 games, 91% of defensive snaps. So he finally broke out. He finally performed like we wanted to. Again, finishing 8th. That's incredible. But take a little look-see at his stats, and it tells maybe a little bit of or foreshadowing a downturn next year. So he finished the year with 71 combined tackles, 10 of which were a tackle for a loss, which is great. But he had a forced fumble, 4 interceptions, and 3 sacks, and 13 passes defended, and a touchdown. Obviously, that is great. Those are a lot of splash plays. Where Hamilton plays in the defense, he is put in a position where he can make these splash plays. But I just want to give a little bit of a warning. Much like Talanoa Hufanga, you cannot always count on splash plays from a fantasy perspective. His 70 or 81 tackles, obviously, that's a really, really nice floor, and he'll continue to be tier 2. He's going to continue to be a great IDP asset. Just not hedging the bets, but just like be wary that, especially at the defensive back position, it's very hard to predict those splash plays. So you love to see, though, that he was getting sacks and interceptions. He was making plays all over the field. Love it. Hopefully that means that he can sustain that moving forward. Just heed the warning a little bit on Kyle Hamilton. I mean, he's going to probably be ranked as either the number 1 or number 2 defensive back in pretty much any scoring system, and rightfully so based on what we saw this year. But I'd rather have some of these other guys later on in your draft as we start talking redraft and all that jazz than picking Hamilton at what the sticker price will be. So just saying, you've been warned. Do with that like you will. All right, up next we have Jalen Petrie. Big old disappointment, and kind of like what Hamilton or the warning I just gave. Defensive backs are so hecking hard to predict. So Petrie ended up 44th in points per game finishing. He did play 15 games, and he played 90% of the defensive snaps. You heard me? 90% of in 15 games. He was out there. He had opportunities. It did not translate into IDP relevancy. So he is kind of like what could happen potentially to Kyle Hamilton next year. So you look at his tackle numbers. He had 84 combined tackles, very similar to what Kyle Hamilton did. But what did he not have? He did not have any splash plays. 0 interceptions, 0 sacks, 1 fumble recovery, 6 tackles for a loss, and only 5 passes defended. That is the difference between these tiers, right? That is still a very, very, very good tackle floor, right? I mean, yeah, 84 combined tackles over those 15 games is, or yeah, 15 games is really good. And he had the percentage of snaps to make you think he'd be fantasy relevant. But that without the splash plays, without that really, really elite tackle floor, it's only good for 44th. Now throw in a few more splash plays here or there, a couple of interceptions, maybe another forced fumble, right? And we're talking a whole different thing because you put him up another point or two per game, and he's finishing top 30, which is obviously great. We thought after his rookie year that he was going to be another one of those top tier guys. Did not translate this year. So he might be good for a bounce back year. You might be able to get him at a discount. So I would probably do that because we expect him to kind of revert back to the mean with that tackle floor where he's using that defense. Get him some splash plays. He'll be a lot better than 44th. But yeah, it's just a word of warning for all of these defensive backs that unless you got to have those tackles and hope they have some splash plays to be relevant. Up next is Cameron Curl, another sleeper that us in the IDP industry have been very, very high on. He finished 23rd overall in points per game finish, 16 games played. He played 100% of the defensive snaps that he played. You love to see it. Let's take a look at his stats. Holy cannoli. Yeah, over 100 combined tackles, 5 passes defended, and 1 sack. So that's just it. Cameron Curl finished 23rd, and that was almost exclusively on tackles, which if you have that elite tackle floor, yeah, you're going to be very good. I mean, 23rd, that's a DB2 in most of our league sizes we're talking about. So Cameron Curl, I expect him to go a little higher next year, to be honest, even if he has slightly fewer tackles. Throw in a couple more of those splash plays and bada bing, bada boom, you got yourself a top 20 guy. So Cam Curl did not live up to the hype that we want him to. He ended up being probably a DB2 for you, so not the worst thing. But if you drafted him to be your DB1, sadly mistaken this year. We were wrong, but he had the opportunities. He just didn't see those splash plays. And finally, rounding out our tier 2, we have Minkah Fitzpatrick. Boy, did he disappoint. Only played in 10 games. When he did play, he was in 79% of the defensive snaps. Not really the usage we expect to see from Minkah Fitzpatrick, but he was injured for a lot of the year. And he ended up finishing 41st in points per game. So disappointing year. Let's take a look at what his stats were here. Yeah, 64 combined tackles, 3 passes defended, 1 tackle for a loss. That's it. That's all he had. So just generally disappointing. Now, he's always been a fascinating IDP player. He seemed to always find a way to make a big play. I might be wrong, but I feel like his tackles are never that high. He just usually has all those splash plays to help buoy his value that he just didn't have. He just didn't have this year. Obviously, injuries are a big part of that. Only 79% of defensive snaps, limits the opportunities for him to put up those points. But yeah, you're gonna be able to get him at a huge old value next year if you trust him. But he's getting up there in age. Obviously, the Steelers did give him a bunch of money, so he's going to get playtime when he's healthy, and hopefully he has better health next year. But there are definitely shinier objects out there who, are more consistent week in, week out. And yeah, this might be the last time I have Minkah Fitzpatrick in tier 2. He might be more tier 3, tier 4 guy until he can prove to me that he can be back on the right track. Let's move on to tier number 3, where we had people in tier 3. We had Grant Delpit, Jeremy Chin, Xavier McKinney, Buda Baker, Julian Love, Antoine Winfield, and finally Kyle Duggar with my New England Patriots. Now, we actually, if we just switched tier 3 and tier 2, we would have absolutely crushed it. We would have been IDP analyst gods. So Grant Delpit, he ended up finishing 21st in points per game. He only played in 13 games played. When he did play, he played 96% of the defensive snaps. So he was out there. He ended up with 80 combined tackles, 1.5 sacks, an interception, 3 passes defended. He was all over the field. He was great for the Browns. Just dynamite player. He got hurt, unfortunately, at the end of the year in either week 14 or week 15 because his year was done after that. So unfortunately, did not help you in the fantasy playoffs, but he probably helped you get in the fantasy playoffs with how he was playing. He's a dynamite asset. I absolutely love him. I mean, finishing 21st is about right. He's about a DB2. So I think we ended up nailing the tier 3 as a whole there. That's just great value when you could get him when people were talking about him 21st overall. Hopefully he comes back healthy and it'll be fine. But yeah, Grant Delpit, solid fantasy asset. Will continue to be in tier 3 presumably, but it's nice to see that he has these types of years in him. Okay, let's talk about one of the biggest whiffs of all time in Jeremy Chin. He played in 12 games, and he only played in 39% of the snaps in those games. He ended up finishing 104th in our points per game, 4.75 points per game. That is absolutely horrendous for someone that used to be, a tier 1, tier 2 guy. Now, the Panthers are a fascinating animal. Well, and a fascinating team. But they obviously they're a bad team. They're rebuilding. They're trying to figure out what they have. But Jeremy Chin, 4 years experience, not the guy in the Panthers. I expect him to be gone at that play time. He just didn't do anything. 30 combined tackles, a sack, a pass defended, and that was it. They didn't even give him the opportunity. They didn't even give him the opportunity to make plays. So he's just certifiably unrosterable until he ends up on a different team. Now, obviously, he had some talent in the past. Some team is going to give him probably a vet min or some nice little contract to get him to play for them. Kind of seems, to be honest, like a New England Patriots signing, something they would do, someone whose value is really low, who's versatile, who's shown they can play the field. So if Kyle Duggar ends up moving on from the Patriots, Jeremy Chin might be a value pickup to replace him. So mark my words, that might happen. That seems like a Patriot thing that could happen. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, certifiable droppable in Dynasty, like not redraft relevant until he gets out of Carolina. Ooh, did we miss that one? Up next, we have Xavier McKinney, ended up finishing 12th overall in points per game. He played all 17 games, but even more impressive, he played 100% of the snaps in those games that he played. Just a solid stalwart there on the Giants defense. Cruised past 120 combined tackles, half a sack, 11 passes defended, 3 interceptions, forced fumble, 2 fumble recoveries, 2 tackles for loss. He was a dynamic player. As you can see there, if you're watching on YouTube, I had him ranked in tier 2. I was really high on him. My compatriots were not. And yeah, I feel validated. Finishing 12th, it's so hard. I mean, all of these players you're going to see, there's only one player who played all 17 games and played 100% of the defensive snaps. You can't score fantasy points if you're not on the field. And David McKinney was not only on the field, but he was producing like a star. So he is still pretty young, second round pick, 4 years experience. The future is all there for him. So he's going to either get, re-signed by the Giants or get a huge contract somewhere. It's been super great. He's going to be a tier 2 guy moving forward. He's someone you can rely on in Dynasty and in redraft for years to come. So Xavier McKinney, nice work. All right, now a fascinating name out of Arizona. We have Buda Baker. Ended up finishing 29th in points per game, 12 games played, but in those 12 games, he did play 100% of the defensive snaps. So what could have been if he had stayed healthy the entire year, but once he came back, he was just a super consistent player for you. He ended up with 87 tackles, 87 combined tackles, absolutely 0 splash plays, which is fascinating. Very rare you see a clean stat sheet like that. But we kind of know who Buda Baker is at this point. 7 years experience. Obviously still with the Cardinals. He used to be one of the top players at the position. He still finished 29th. So in leagues like this one that the IDP guys, soon to be IDP Plus run, was still very relevant. I mean, 29th overall, and you picked him up midseason. Really solid production, not league winning, but solid at 29th. That's kind of who he is. And if you add some splash plays, kind of like some of those other folks we're talking about, like Kyle Hamilton, right? He jumps up to be a top 20 guy. So I think he's still the guy. He's still obviously the 100% of defensive snaps. He's When he's healthy, he's still the guy for the Cardinals. I don't really see much of that changing moving forward. So Buda Baker, I think we should have to temper expectations. He's not going to be that DB1 necessarily, or at least not a DB1 lock like he might have been a couple of years ago. But he is solidly in the DB3 with DB2 upside any given week. So good on you. Julian Love is up next, and what a pleasant surprise he was there for the Giants. He ended up 7th overall in points per game. He played all 17 games, but he only played 79% of the defensive snaps in those games. So this is another one of those guys where obviously you cannot argue with production. He ended up with 123 combined tackles, 4 interceptions, 10 passes defended, a couple of forced fumbles in the fumble recovery. He had the tackles. He had the splash plays. It all worked, right? I mean, finishing 7th, it all had to sort of work, right, in points per game, especially when you play all 17 games. But he only played 79% of the defensive snaps. Like I said before, you can't score IDP points when you are not on the field. Typically, my rule of thumb, especially at the defensive back, is I really only want to be rostering and playing folks that are out there 90 plus times. So obviously some people have some rest, but these elite players don't leave the field. And Julian Love did. Especially at the defensive back. Like linebackers, my rule is about 80% because a little more wear and tear on those players, so they get their rest. Obviously, the best ones play 100%, but 80%. But defensive backs, if you start looking at playtime, there are just a bunch of backs that are in that 90 to 100% sort of spot. So seeing 79 for Julian Love, that is a little worrying for me personally to say, yes, he's going to be another top 10 lock. We started talking about this beginning of last year too. Defensive backs have the most turnover in terms of repeat top 10 finishers. So he's definitely one pretty easy candidate for me to say, yep, he's still going to be relevant, right? Like he's still going to probably be a DB3. But do I expect him to finish 7th overall with that kind of playtime? I absolutely do not. So if you have him in Dynasty, he's kind of a sell high for me because of that playtime. Maybe you can sell him to somebody who's not paying attention as much. In redraft, yeah, don't let someone else overpay for him based off of this year's sort of stats. But yeah, finishing 7th. I'm seeing Steve, my usual co-host Steve, had him in the league where this scoring was happening. So, Steve, you got a good one there. Good job. I would not expect him to do that again. All right, up next, the number 1 overall defensive back finisher on the year, Antoine Winfield with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He ended up with 18.282 points per game. He played 17 games. He played 98% of the defensive snaps. He was out there. He was crushing it. How did he do it? Really, how else would you expect? He ended up with 100 and, am I reading that right? Yeah, 122 combined tackles, 6 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, 6 sacks, 3 interceptions, 12 passes defended. If there is a stat from a fantasy perspective, Antoine Winfield just filled it on the stat sheet week in, week out. Now, this was a fantasy winner. We had him as tier 3. He's kind of boom or bust in the past, and he just absolutely crushed it this entire year. He didn't miss a single game. His fewest scoring points was 6 points in week 6, conveniently, against the Lions. But every other week, just absolutely crushing it for you. It's hard to repeat as the top scoring player at any position, right? And he is a free agent after this year. people are expecting him to maybe set the market for defensive back contracts. So there's a lot of things to wonder about Antoine Winfield. Where is he going to end up? Where is he going to be a good fit? Are they going to use him like the Bucks used him this year, or are there going to be other players that are going to take up some of those spots on the defense that score points? A lot of question marks. So pretty quintessential sell high guy for me. He's because there's a lot of red flags about what he's going to do next year. Not trying to be a hater. Obviously, this was a huge year, but like history has shown that people don't repeat, and especially Antoine Winfield, who's very hit or miss in his previous years in the NFL. So obviously, phenomenal year, an IDP, potentially IDP league winner if you got him when you got him. Finishing first overall is no small feat. So great job, but be very interested to monitor where he ends up, how he'll be used on that defense, and so on and so forth with Antoine Winfield. Wrapping up tier 3, we have Kyle Duggar from the New England Patriots. He ended up finishing just a respectable 20th overall in points per game. He played all 17 games. He had 98 combined tackles. What else, what is there to say about Kyle Duggar except for very similar things to Winfield? He is a free agent. The question is, are the Patriots going to sign him? Is he the future? I think we found his ceiling, unfortunately, from an IDP perspective, which is probably this 20th overall finisher. He's kind of finished in the teens to the 20th for the last couple of years. Obviously, he's used on the defense, 98% of defensive snaps, didn't miss any games. Like, that's huge. And that consistency is rewarding in IDP. Like, set it and forget it kind of guys, your DB2. That's really nice. He had small number of splash plays. Really, the tackles were kept him up there in the top 20. But yeah, where does he end up? Is he going to stick with the Pats? Like, if the Patriots pay him, that second contract bump, that means they have big plans, and he's going to be playing with, he'll be getting the same play time moving forward. The Patriots kind of found lightning in the bottle with Jabril Peppers this year. Marte Mapu also was drafted in a similar time. Similar spot as Duggar was drafted 4 years ago. A lot of people are projecting that Mapu might be taking over the Duggar role. So I think it'll tell you a lot about his potential play time if he does resign with the Patriots. Otherwise, I mean, he gets tackles. He's usually in the right spot. He was kind of exposed in the actual defending the pass a few times, which is expected, but really Duggar's fantasy value is in those tackles and gets just enough splash plays that he ends up being that DB2 for you. I don't really expect that to change depending on where he goes, but we love that consistency there when you have it. So hopefully he stays with the Patriots for years to come and continues to be a dynamite fantasy asset. Okay, let's move on to tier 4. What we had in tier 4, smaller tiers here towards the end. But yeah, tier 4 is when we get some cornerbacks. We felt like it's important to talk about cornerbacks. We here at IDP Plus want to make cornerbacks relevant, so our scoring our scoring rewards things that cornerbacks typically get, like passes defended and things like that, more so than other scoring systems, just to make them relevant. And we are a cornerback required league. Of note, if you are watching on YouTube or paying or paying attention and following along with the fantasy finishes, the cornerbacks are finished. Their finishes are related to other cornerbacks because we're a cornerback league. It was not overall with other defensive backs. But tier number 4, 3 people: Rayshon Jenkins, L'Jarius Sneed, and Ahmad Sauce Gardner. Starting with Rayshon Jenkins, we had him in tier 4, and I think he performed exactly like you'd expect a tier 4 player to finish 28th overall in points per game. He played 17 games. He played 99% of the defensive snaps. Yeah, pretty much exactly what we expected for him to be. I mean, you don't play 99% of defensive snaps and not be fantasy relevant. It's very difficult to do. He ended up with 101 combined tackles, a sack, 2 interceptions, 9 passes defended. So a lot of really, really good stuff. Just doesn't have that elite tackle floor or enough splash plays to catapult him up into the top 25. But that's what we can kind of expect from Rayshon Jenkins. 7-year vet. he got paid obviously with Jacksonville. Yeah, he's nothing more, nothing less than that. So there are spots where that is, if you're in these deeper leagues like we're in, where that's super fantasy relevant. Like, if you're out there rolling out 3 defensive backs, namely 3 safeties, yeah, go ahead and play Rayshon Jenkins with confidence. He's going to finish as that top 30 guy. Don't really see that changing. But without, either, obviously tackles are a little more consistent. So without the higher tackle floor, those random splash plays make it hard for him to really break through the ceiling of that tier 4. But again, I'm all here for it. If you heard me rant about Fred Warner and Logan Wilson, especially Logan Wilson, there's a space in the fantasy community for folks that are, not sexy, just, go into work, get the job done, help you advance in fantasy. Towards the end of drafts, those are the guys I often target. Okay, L'Jarius Sneed, the cornerback for the Kansas City Chiefs. He ended up finishing 14th in points per game of the cornerback position, 16 games played, 99% of the defensive snaps. So let's see what his stats ended up looking like. So he's often regarded as the 101 in terms of cornerbacks dynasty redraft. He has now 2 straight years of really nice fantasy production. Let's see, he ended up with 78 combined tackles, 1 fumble recovery, 2 interceptions, 14 passes defended. Why I had him and why we had him in tier 4 and not tier 5 with these other defensive backs. Yeah, it's just he has a knack of making these big plays, and he doesn't leave the field. Now, I was worried about Trent McDuffie sort of coexisting with L'Jarius Sneed. So in general, I had L'Jarius Sneed a little knocked down because Trent McDuffie taking over the slot corner spot, and he did great this year. I think he ended up all pro, first team all pro. So I was worried that was going to take away L'Jarius Sneed's ability to, get those tackles, get those splash plays. But gall dang it, he did it. I mean, he still finished 14th overall. And if you pay attention on the screen about the points per game, 14th overall for cornerbacks was 2 or 1.5 points more points per game than, the number 28th safety. So again, we're really making in Rayshon Jenkins. So we're really trying to make cornerbacks relevant. So L'Jarius Sneed was a great asset to have in this league, especially when we require you to start 2 cornerbacks. So the future of L'Jarius Sneed is definitely in doubt. I mean, Trent McDuffie is still there. I think he's still the number 1 cornerback because he's generally in spots that make a whole bunch of plays. So whether he stays with the Chiefs or not, I think will not impact, his fantasy standing. Obviously, we don't like variability, but yeah, L'Jarius Sneed's still very relevant. He performed really well. I think we nailed the spot here. Why we have some cornerbacks here is you want to talk about some, especially these big old names like Sneed and Sauce Gardner they're about to talk about. But 14.15 points per game, especially when you're in a scoring system like we have that boosts some of the stats that cornerbacks get. Nothing this needs that. That's why he's drafted so high, finishing 14th. I'm not going to be too mad about it where he ended up. And the final tier 4 guy we had was, like I said, Sauce Gardner. Extremely disappointing fantasy season. Kind of just encapsulated the Jets overall. He ended up finishing 75th overall. He did play 16 games. He was on the field for 99% of the defensive snaps. Why I had him in tier 4 is that he sees the field. He sees the field. Now, my strategy with rookie cornerbacks, if you follow me, if you've listened to any of our stuff, I love rookie cornerbacks, regardless of where they're drafted, because they're still figuring out the NFL. I don't care how good you're going to be. You're not going to be a shutdown cornerback year 1. People are going to pick on you, and then you get fancy stats like those tackles and assists and whatnot. That happened with Ahmad Gardner last year, or 2 years ago now at this point. This year, though, he kind of turned into that shutdown corner, and as we all know, those are not good for fantasy purposes because quarterbacks just don't throw it at them. Not ideal. And we see that in his stats, right? He ended up with 57 combined tackles, 11 passes defended, which is really good. That's what even elevated him, up to the 75th overall cornerback. But there are just so many guys who are, worse in the real life NFL sense than Sauce Gardner, and or play in a spot like in the corner that just rack up stats. So yeah, I think the Ahmad Gardner train is kind of done for me. I even in these cornerback required leagues, after that rookie year, kind of losing the steam there. There'll always be other young cornerbacks for quarterbacks to pick on. Unfortunately, Sauce Gardner's IDP relevancy is probably coming to a close. All right, let us do the final tier 5 review here. So again, only 3 folks in this tier 5. We had Jamal Adams, Chauncey Gardner Johnson, and Marcus Jones. Yeah, not kind of all 3 kind of suffered the same fate. So Jamal Adams ended up finishing 51st in points per game. He only played 9 games. When he did play, at 84% of the defensive snaps. Just extremely disappointing that he did not do more with those opportunities. 84% of defensive snaps, like I said earlier, is enough to be relevant, but you expect for him to, score more points. Obviously, only 9 games means he had limited opportunities to have those bigger games to buoy his overall scoring. But just overall disappointing. We both, we had him in tier 5 for a reason. Didn't really know like health wise where he was going to be at, or even play time, and kind of feel validated in that. Like, I'm going to let him be someone else's problem moving forward. Just leave him for someone else. And yeah, Chauncey Gardner Johnson and Marcus Jones suffered very similar seasons in the sense that they were cut short quite a bit. So CGJ did finish 10th overall in points per game, which is awesome if you played him in the 3 games that he actually played. He had 89% of the defensive snaps. He's lighting it up right now in the playoffs. Pretty sure I saw him go across. Let's make sure that's true. Like I said, we're holding ourselves accountable. You have to. Yeah, he's crushing it in the playoffs. I thought so. But that doesn't help us in regular season IDP, fantasy leagues. But he's definitely a hold, because in those 3 games, again, he had 15 points per game. He's an absolute stud. He has been for a couple of years. Just unfortunate that he got hurt when he did. Why I had him in tier 5, I want to see him repeat his breakout performance that he had, the year before. And I guess he kind of did, but then he didn't do it over any sort of period of time. So jury's still out on how I feel about CGJ moving forward. Jury's still out. I'll probably bump him up to a tier 4 next year, but yeah, interesting guy. And then Marcus Jones with the Pats. He was here. We all had him as tier 5. He finished 138th overall. He only played 2 games. He only saw 34% of the defensive snaps. Why we even talked about him, if you remember back in time when he was playing on offense and was a dynamic punt returner and played sparingly on defense as well. We even just brought him up here just for the chance that he would have more of a role on offense and get those punt return yards, as some leagues do get points for. Unfortunately, he got super hurt, much like the rest of the good players on the Patriots defense, good young players anyway, and did not really have an opportunity to get you any of those points. So big swing and a miss there. I guess the one benefit is he was done pretty dang early in the season. So while he probably hurt you if you were playing him for those first couple of weeks, the pain was over quick, because you didn't have the opportunity to hold on to him because he got hurt and was done for the year. So yeah, interesting to see where he ends up on that young Patriots defense in the years to come. But you're not going to feel confident trusting him in any format, even rostering at this point, until he does some more things on that there field. Okay, that is going to do it for this episode of the IDP Plus podcast. Thanks for sticking it out with me. It's always fun going back in time and looking at where you had people ranked at the time and where they kind of finished. Like, holding yourself accountable, you learn from that by putting the whole picture together with the games played and the percentage of snaps. You can kind of predict who has the chance to regress either positively or negatively. And if you don't talk about your big misses too, then what are you doing here? We're all only human. We're just doing our best with the data that we have. So it's fun going back in time. I wish, I wish we had some of these back, obviously, but for the most part, I think we did a pretty decent job getting you ready last year. So with that, again, my name is Matt Record at mrecord21. We have so much great stuff happening right now in IDP Plus. We have near daily articles talking about the past and the future. Dynasty rookie content is going to be heating up. Redraft drafts. We have a whole bunch of videos here on this channel. We're doing mock drafts. We obviously have our podcasts. We again have rookie stuff coming out. It's never been a better time to be a follower of IDP Plus. If you head over to idpguys.org, you can use the code that's been on the YouTube screen the entire time, IDP Plus Pod. That's IDP, the symbol, plus pod for 10% off of any of our subscriptions there over at idpguys.org. We are rebranding to IDP Plus after the Super Bowl, so be on the lookout for that. That's pretty exciting. But yeah, it's been a dang pleasure. If you've stuck with me this entire time, it was fun hanging out. I know next week I will not be here as I'll be traveling for work. So hopefully Steve is back and Steve will have someone else to probably go over the last position we have to review how we did, which was defensive tackles. So with that, I hope you have a lovely week. And this has been the IDP Plus podcast. See ya.
Thank you for watching this IDP Guys video. If you like this content and you want more fantasy football content, click here. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos to help you master your IDP league, click here to subscribe.